Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Unbound podcast. This week, it's just Jonathan and I. It's just the two of us. We're going to have a little conversation, and as you've probably read in the title of this podcast already, we're asking kind of a counterintuitive question for an organization that sells a college program, which is, do we really need college? And you might actually be surprised by by the extent to which we think maybe you don't. And so the kind of I think especially right now with the onset of COVID and with the way that the education model is changing, there are so many students that are paying, tuition and then watching Zoom classes and wondering, why am I doing this? In fact, there's a meme that was going around a few weeks ago that was really funny that was talking about, it basically just said that these streaming services are getting really out of hand, and it had, the Netflix price and the Hulu price that said Harvard University is at $50,000 for a streaming service. It's like, what's going on here? And I think that resonates with a lot of students. That's how a lot of students feel right now. I think I'm just gonna go ahead and like drop the bomb and hand it to you, Jonathan, and just say, do we really need college?
I think the important part about that question is asking it, right? I think so many people are scared to ask that question. And maybe it's not even scared. Most people don't even think about asking that question. In other words, this is one of our culture and society's biggest assumed answers. And the assumed answer is, if you want to be successful, then you need to go to college. And if you want to, and insert whatever job you think is horrible here, digging ditches, whatever, whatever is the worst possible thing you can think of, that's where you're going to end up if you don't go to college. And so there's this assumed answer: successful people go to college. But I'm always kind of a contrarian and cantankerous, and I want to go and say, well, what exactly was college for? And if you take a little bit look at the history of college, college was for training for certain jobs that needed academic backgrounds. And so originally that had been things like ministers, lawyers and judges, lawmakers, legislators, so those kinds of folks, certainly doctors. And so people that had a real need for deep intellectual academic thought. Interestingly, over the last 75 years, colleges have become the de facto professional preparation service. And the interesting thing is that that's not really what they're good at. Colleges are designed to be academic preparation places. And so if you are somebody who needs that kind of academic preparation, then colleges can be really fantastic. But if you're not, it's worth kind of asking, is college really what you need to do? So I like to kind of come back and say, what is it that you want to do? And I think one of the surprising answers in today's world is if your answer is, I want to be successful, or I want to have a solid job and be able to pay my bills and support myself and a family, then I think there's a surprising amount of times when college is not necessary for that. And in fact, because of the debt load that comes with college and because of the time load that comes with college, college, in fact, can be an impediment to that goal. Now, if you want to be a doctor, you want to be a lawyer, you want to be an engineer, you want to be a nurse, if you want to get a job in certain rare circles, like, you want to get a job at a super high-end law firm or something like that, then not only is college necessary, some colleges are specifically necessary, right? There is an elite set of legal careers that probably are only available to people who graduate from Ivy Leagues. And that's just a reality. But if you're not competing for those jobs, and that's not interesting to you, and if you're not in those categories, then you may find that college is indeed not for you. Then another interesting question, Ben, that we might ask is, okay, if college is for you, is college doing what it's supposed to? Is college actually preparing you for whatever it is that you need? And so maybe I'll throw that back to you and say, what do you think? Do you need a college degree? You've had a pretty interesting career where you have a college degree, but have you needed a college degree?
No. And that's the interesting thing is there's a lot of ways to look at it, but let's even break down just the traditional idea of you need a degree so that you can get a job. Okay, well, let's start there. So you get a degree. Why would you need a degree to get a job? Well, pretty much you need a degree to get a job if you are submitting your resume to those HR systems that will throw your resume away if you don't have a degree listed on your resume. But that's never been the case for me. I've actually never applied for a job. In fact, there's been a few times where I got a job where I didn't even have an interview. And so in my circumstance, my degree, it basically has done nothing in terms of actually supporting my career so far. And I've had about 5 jobs at this point. I'm on my fifth one. And so I think particularly if you're talking about, it really just depends on what you're looking at and what kinds of skills you're trying to acquire. And something that a lot of people don't realize, there's plenty of trade jobs that pay incredibly well that do not require degrees. And there are trade schools that are far more affordable that could get students started in that direction. So it's like there are a few obvious areas where it's like if you're looking for a trade, you definitely don't need a degree. You just need a few skills, and then you need some work experience, and then you're going to be making decent money. You could have an entire career without a degree. There are a few areas where having a degree obviously makes sense if you're trying to be a doctor or a lawyer or an expert in some field, or in areas like psychology where having a PhD is practically required to operate. Then yes, you do need a degree and you need expert level academics. But then there's a huge middle area that includes a lot of people where if you have some professional experience, especially these days, businesses are more and more open to accepting applicants who don't have degrees. And for the most part, in my own experience, if I'm getting a job, it's typically not because I applied for it, it's because I've been referred. And so if you have work experience, if you have, even the beginnings, like a little bit of kindling of a professional network, which we talked all about last week is professional networking. If you have something going there, then a degree, it may not even be needed or required. In fact, I did it. And the primary thing that I got out of my college experience was all of the peripheral things that came from Unbound, which was things like serving on the student cabinet, things that I learned about leadership, and things that I learned about things I was really interested in, like filmmaking, media production, marketing. Those were all things that I learned outside of my degree. I have a bachelor's degree in economics. I initially chose that major because economics is interesting to me, and I was planning to go to law school. And I was told that economics was a good undergraduate degree for getting a JD later on. I later decided to forego getting a law degree. And so the bachelor's degree became even less relevant in my life. Now, if I ever decided to go back, is it relevant? Yeah. Is it nice to have it? Yeah. But because I went through Unbound, was it a whole lot cheaper than it would have been otherwise? Definitely. And so I'm glad I did it the way I did it. But I honestly think that if I had gone to a traditional education model, obviously it would have been super expensive. I wouldn't have wanted to go into debt for it. And even just in terms of how the school model works these days, I actually think I would have dropped out. Like, I think I probably would have gotten maybe into my sophomore year, maybe junior. And then I would have decided that it was just a waste of time, and I would have pursued a career outside of college.
I think that brings us to this idea then, what is a degree good for? What is a college degree good for? And Ben, you and I have spent a lot of time talking, and frankly, a lot of Unbound is built on these conversations, and we've had them for years, preceding our working together here at Unbound, which is this idea of a functional education. And let me sort of set this up a little bit, and then Ben, maybe you can speak to it a little. But a functional education to me is one that actually reflects real life. And here's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. I don't think it's particularly valuable if we spend a lot of time in bubbles. And to me, a bubble is any time you're in a sort of an artificial environment that is only good for that specific place and time and doesn't really transfer to other places and times, right? And so colleges are sort of the ultimate artificial bubble. You go into a college and nothing that happens on a college campus is particularly normal towards everything else. There's no other time in your life when everybody around you is going to be about the same age. There's no other time in your life when everybody around you is going to have so little to do. And I know you study at college, but you have so much flexibility in their schedule. There's no other time in your life when everything you do is going to be so neatly and easily measured. So you're going to get these clear grades and numbers and stuff like that. That just doesn't happen any other time. There's no other time in your life where you're just going to be able to hang out in the dorms and not have a lot of responsibility, and that somebody else is going to cook for you and do your dishes and provide all these services, and it's a comprehensive package. Like that's a bubble. That's an artificial environment. And so my contention is the more time you spend in that artificial environment, the less time you actually are learning about how the real world works. And this comes back to something we talked about before. If you're going into a career that is very academic based, law, I would say most things that require some master's or graduate programs, right? Then college actually does have a lot of advantages because it's putting you in a networking situation. It's putting you in a situation where you're associating with other people and you're trading in ideas. And that's kind of what your life is going to look like, right? If you're a lawyer, you spend a lot of time in that kind of artificial bubble, right? You're going to spend a lot of time talking about theoretical ideas and moving them back and forth and all those kinds of things. Like that's going to continue your professional career. But then, as Ben mentioned earlier, there's a large swath of us that what happens in college bears nothing to do with the rest of life, right? In my case, I went to college, I graduated magna cum laude, so that's like almost the highest honors. I got great grades, I had a 4.0 in my major, and nothing that I've done since then looks anything like that. Not a single class has translated to my career. Not one single item of information. Now, there was skills that I learned in college that transferred. There were connections I made in college that were useful. But my job, my work situation, my life has never looked anything like the bubble that I was living in on campus. And so, in many ways, I would call that a dysfunctional education versus a functional education. So, Ben, when you think about a functional education, what are some of your definitions?
I mean, everyone learns differently, but when I think of a functional education, especially when I'm looking at it personally, is I think of hands-on experience. And that doesn't, necessarily mean literally a trade. It just means, actually doing the thing you're interested in doing. And for me, that's been the game changer is I tend to be more on the kinesthetic side of the spectrum. And so it's like, if I'm going to learn how to do marketing or media production, the fastest way I learn it and the best way that I retain that information is by doing it. And that basically just means I create a lot of terrible products for a while, and then eventually I get good at it. And I've kind of accepted that that's the way that I learn best. That's the way that I retain information. That's basically the complete opposite of what you would consider a standard academic learning style. I could sit in a class all day and watch tutorials about lighting and how to build a funnel. But then when I set out to do it, I'm almost as bad as if I hadn't even attended the class. And then even retention is a huge issue too, where I've forgotten almost everything I've learned in college, but I remember a lot of the principles and the ideas from things that I actually have experience in doing, which makes sense. And I think in particular, when you're talking about something like, I think film school is a great example. So I've been involved in film, since high school. A bunch of my friends have either been interested in or have even gone to film school. And to be 100% frank, I think it's a waste of time. I think that the value in film school, if it were the 1970s or the 1980s right now, where, going to film school had a tremendous amount of value because you could watch, an influential film from a Japanese filmmaker from the 1930s. And there was no way that you could get access to that film unless you were at film school. But today, I could go on Netflix. I could go on a variety of streaming services. I could pay $12.99 a month instead of $50,000 a month, right? And I can find those films and I can study them. I can go on YouTube and I can watch video essays where filmmakers, expand on like the different storytelling devices and the tools and the gear that was used by these filmmakers to accomplish these things. And that's how I've learned filmmaking. Is I never went to film school. That's how I learned it. And I think, especially with the internet and just the amount of access to information that we have now, and also just the number of jobs and volunteer opportunities that are available, learning on the job, I think it's the best way. For me, it's definitely the best way. And so much of it is available for free or at a tremendous discount compared to what you might pay at university to get the same information, to be taught it in a class and then to forget it and then to relearn it when you find a job in that field 3 years later. And so I think in particular, like I was just looking at a quick stat before we hopped on this podcast, and the National Center for Education Statistics says that the most popular degrees are in business, communications, social sciences, psychology, and maybe with the exception of psychology, with that one, it really depends on what your sort of end goal is. But if you're looking at, communications and social sciences and business, there's a lot of opportunities to learn those things outside of a diploma. And I will say, to kind of transition back and maybe play the other side for 2 seconds, is I think the value of a degree is that it represents a certain amount of learning, and it represents an education, and in some cases it represents experience. I think sometimes certificates can represent more experience than necessarily a degree, but at least it represents a certain level of knowledge. And because I've also been in situations where I will go volunteer to work on a project, but nobody there knows how much I know about something. And so they don't know how to basically place me on the team. And so, there's plenty of ways to interact. A lot of the times, I will basically do the volunteer work, and then over time they will become aware of what I know. But the thing that's nice about a degree or a certificate is having something that represents a level of knowledge or competence in different areas, and then being able to hand that to someone as a shorthand for, hey, these are things that I know and can do, and then you can it sort of accelerates that process. Um,
We can maybe use a pretty interesting analogy on that. And that is when we say functional education, Ben and I have talked about this. Both Ben and I are interested in another kind of functional stuff, and that is functional exercise, right? There's all kinds of, getting fit and working out and gym memberships and all that kind of stuff. Those are obviously big moneymaker things in businesses, and there's 10,000 different ways to do that. But one thing I've been struck by is that most workout regimes and kind of processes and stuff like that, they assume and they sell something that's not practically true. And basically, this is the workout the NFL stars use. Okay, but are you facing 200-pound linebacker, 250-pound, 280-pound linebackers in the backfield every Sunday, right?
yeah.
No, then probably you don't need to kill yourself in an NFL workout, right? This is a workout star that's, something that, power lifter A use. Okay, well, are you typically doing powerlifting competitions? Well, then why are you wasting your time on this? And then it's interesting because it gets more and more specialized, right? So you have this very, very specialized stuff. And then the ultimate sort of epitome of this is specialized machines. And now we're getting into something even more interesting, which is we have specialized machines that can work certain body parts to make us look really good. So, how many ads have you seen for flat six-pack abs? And how many abs have you seen for ripping biceps or whatever, right? Now we're not talking about functional. We're not even saying that we're going to be an elite athlete. We're talking about mere appearances. And there's a very, very interesting similarity there between education, right? There are some educational processes that are very specialized, that are perfect for specialized people. If you are an NFL receiver, you should need an NFL workout. If you're going to be a brain surgeon, you need a specialized academic program, right? And there's an awful lot of academics that are just ripped bicep academic, right? They're just for show. It's to get the credential and all these things. Now, what we're talking about is a functional education. Functional fitness is fitness for a person who, does some athletic things, but they're not a paid athlete, who wants to stay fit and wants to be healthy and wants to live a very good life where they can do the kinds of things that they need to do and without injury, right? In other words, it's a useful fitness level that can be used in a variety of different ways. A functional education should do the same thing, right? A functional education should allow you to do certain things, but it should prepare you for a lot of different things. And so maybe it'd be interesting to kind of break down this and talk about it, because Ben, you said something interesting, that there are places where you indeed need a degree. But I want to ask the question, what is it that you need from that degree? And I would submit that a specialized degree gives you specific knowledge about something you need: nursing, engineering, okay? Important degrees, no argument from me that you ought to do them, and probably ought to do them at a traditional college in most cases, right? But now let's talk about something different. Let's talk about this kind of functional education. I think for most of us, functional education means the ability to quickly and effectively master complicated information. So let's sort of use our analogy again here. You can have a bar with weights on it, right? And you can curl that thing, and you can use it. You can use weights, in other words, to do some of this sort of appearance fitness, right? But you can also use weights in a very functional way that gives you functional training. I'm a big fan of kettlebells, right? So kettlebells are weights, but they're weights that are much more focused on functional fitness than specific, strength or sort of appearance strength. And so I would say that a degree can be used like a kettlebell, right? You can use a degree where you're not so much interested in the specific knowledge that the degree gives you. You're not so much interested in the specific content of the classes or even the major. Instead, you're using the degree as a tool to teach you to quickly and effectively master complicated information. In other words, to teach you how to learn. And it gives you the added advantage of the fact that right now, a degree is a powerful credential in our society. I have some arguments that makes me think that perhaps that won't be the case forever. But right now, it certainly is. So, functional education is where you use a degree to learn the more transcendent skill of being able to learn. And that's a functional skill that you're going to be able to apply across a wide range of careers. And for most of us, not if you're a specialist, but for most of us, that's the kind of functional academic education that actually makes a difference. Um, what do you think, Ben? You can add on to that, or what other? You mentioned the fact that you had a lot of doing skills. So, what are some of the functional skills that you think maybe comes in around the college years, but maybe aren't specifically academic?
Yeah, well, that's a great way to frame it, because I think learning how to learn, especially at the speed at which life can change these days, which has been made readily apparent this year, learning how to learn is perhaps the most important thing to learn, at the risk of being repetitive. Um, and um, and for me, it's been a huge benefit. And even just having a vision for the way different disciplines can inform each other in unexpected ways. That's something I'm constantly fascinated by. Say you learn how to use a certain piece of software, or I think a great example of this is the guy that started Twitter had a background in theater, and actually thinks that his background in theater is like very much helped him um, create Twitter. So things like having an understanding of storytelling, or voice, or something like that, and you will find, the more that you learn, the more that you find kind of applications, and that increases the speed of your learning. That's kind of been my experience, is like, especially exposing yourself to a broader range of ideas. I'm even just talking about like somebody like Patrick Mahomes, who's one of the biggest quarterbacks right now. You look at his sports history, and he played a lot of baseball, and he played a lot of different sports, and he actually takes ideas from other sports and applies them to football in unexpected ways, and it helps him win games. And so I think even things like that, and especially with the amount of information that we have available to us, and the amount of experience that's available for free these days, there's no reason not to just be exploring completely random things and not view it as a waste of time. Um, in fact, one of my favorite quotes is actually a Derek Sivers quote. I believe he said it on a Tim Ferriss podcast, but he says, if information was the problem, we would all be millionaires with six-pack abs. And so I think when I think about functional education, I don't think about information, which is typically what academics is obsessed with. Academics is all about information. We have information. It's all here. Most of it's free or cheap, or somebody who knows what you want to know. A lot of education. So because of that, education is primarily about credentialing now, and then you say, well, how much is the credential worth, and do you really need it? And that's changing too. And so when I think about functional education, I don't think as much about information as much as I think about application. It's about taking something and applying it to a circumstance, and then also keeping your eyes open and looking around and saying, are there any other places where this idea works? And finding those crossovers can sometimes lead to discoveries that are completely new and exciting, and can make you an expert in something that doesn't even exist yet. And so I think that kind of potential is what's really exciting. And that's what learning how to learn really creates a launching pad for.
I think that as we continue like to explore this idea of functional education, so on one hand, it's about like education, as Ben's just talked about, which connects random things and brings these things together, stuff like that. It's education that helps you to figure out how to learn, that sort of instills a love of learning and sort of gives you the tools to be able to learn. But let's go back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is this idea that traditional education, as we see it now, often results in bubble status, right? Like you're living in a bubble. And so to me, functional education means something else, which is functional education should be academic information that's less about the information and more about, and if you need the credential, it should be more about the process. It's the tools, it's the learning itself, right? That makes a difference, right? So it's teaching you how to learn, not so much teaching you what you learned. And so that would be one function of it. But the other idea of functional education would be to put yourself in an environment that looks more real and less bubble. And so, let me give you a quick contrast as an example. If you're in a box school education, right? So you're going to traditional college, and then you're on the bubble. And so you're in classes, and they may or may not be teaching you functional educational ideas, but you're in that environment. And then you go back to a dorm environment. As we talked about, that's not really realistic. And then you're living in a cafeteria, you're eating in a cafeteria environment in normal times, and that's not really realistic. And then maybe you're playing a sport. And honestly, that can be a lot of fun. And I got nothing against sports, and love to play them myself, and was an athlete in college myself. And yet, I was an athlete in college, and I've not been an athlete like I was an athlete in college ever since. So that was a bit of a bubble existence, even though I enjoyed what I did there. But so that's sort of different. And then what other things you're doing? You're on some clubs and organizations, things like that. And again, they look nothing like the clubs and organizations you're going to be at later. Okay, so what's that contrasted to in a functional education? Well, functional education would be a place where that educational academic component didn't took up as little time as possible, because really it's the tools, it's not the information that's really important here. And that allowed time for you to do two other things, right? One of those things would be to build experience, to take what you're learning in the classroom and experiment with it in real life. And so that means instead of working an internship, you work a job where you get paid. That means that instead of being in a club on campus, you're in a community organization that's a real community organization that has all kinds of ages of people in it. That means that, when you're taking your ideas and making them work, it's not a theoretical mock trial or theoretical mock idea that's happening on campus. It's a real idea that actually has real consequences, real ideas behind it, real money behind it, and doing those things. So that'd be one aspect. The other aspect would be that I think a good functional education gives you connections. One of the things that happens with college is you meet people, right? And so a functional education should be a time in life that exposes you to people and connections that you would not otherwise be exposed and connected to. So perhaps the best way for you to do some of the functional work and experience and community things and jobs like that is to stay in your community that you've grown up in. That could be really interesting. We talked about this in our community podcast a couple of weeks ago. But a functional education should at the same time expose you to another group of people that you did not know from your community, so that all of a sudden you have a richer network and more contacts, and they expose you to new ideas that you can then explore and figure out and do all those kinds of things. So I would argue that those are kind of our three pieces of functional education. An education process that's more about the process and the tools than it is about the information. That's the educational academic part of it. A process that allows you the time to test the ideas that you're learning in real life and to experience real life things in a real life setting with real life consequences. And that three, exposes you to a greater network of people so that you're expanding who you know and getting exposed to new ideas and new people and new things. And we might add to that new places, right? Being able to go to new places. So talk about that a little bit on your side, Ben, because I think when I think of functional education, you're a bit of a poster child for this, right? I don't think I got a functional education. This is something I've come into and working with people and seeing things differently. I had a traditional education, but in many ways, let's apply those. You got an education in economics that probably very much was about the information, but more about the techniques and teaching you these things, right? You did all these real world things, and we've talked about some of those in the podcast before. And you definitely build a network of people. So maybe talk about that a little bit from an insider view, what that looked like and what that felt like.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think something like kind of a good takeaway for anybody listening to this is that a functional education philosophy can be applied, I believe, could be applied to any circumstance, including if you're locked into a traditional academic environment. And the reason I say that is because, so like, let's take, for example, like I would do college courses. I would have to write papers, do the regular thing. And there's a lot of students who do this, but I would focus on when I was in a class, I would try to figure out what exactly does my teacher want to see me learn, right? So I wouldn't just sort of accept the course content as is. I would look for ways to sort of hack my classes where I would say, and it wasn't just about minimizing effort. It was really more about efficiency. It was about saying, all right, like what does my teacher care about? And then how can I sort of get to those points faster so that I can complete more things at once? And so I kind of...
Which on the side is an educational aspect of things, but it looks exactly like the skills that you need to figure out what your boss needs so you can give him or her whatever they need. Yeah,
exactly. And so it's like there's always things you could be learning that will apply later in life, no matter what situation you're in. So that I firmly believe it's like it doesn't matter if you're in a really bad spot with like, you have maybe your professor thinks that like you're an idiot, or your boss basically doesn't recognize your skills at all, or has no understanding of what you do. It's like, there's something you can learn from that. And I've even been in employment situations where, every day I was in a difficult circumstance, and I would feel like I wasn't like a valued employee. And what I was doing instead is I was internalizing and going, okay, like, I want to understand why this is happening, and I want to make sure that nobody who ever works for me feels this way, right? There's still something I can learn from an environment like that. And so I think that, like, at its core, a functional education is a mindset, and it's a genuine learner's mindset that can be that can always be active. It's like, if you're awake, you could be learning something, and that doesn't mean constant motion. It doesn't mean never resting, although I do struggle with resting. But it just means having an attitude and mindset. Or even like when I'm doing jujitsu, I don't walk into the jujitsu gym every day and say like, all right, I'm going to walk in and try to win at every single point in time. And if I don't, I'm going to feel like I didn't, like I'm a failure. That's not a learner's mindset. I'll go into a gym and I'll let somebody who's been training a little bit less time than me get into a really good position, and I'll let them, like really lock that position in, and then try to figure out how to get out. That's a learner's mindset. If you find yourself in a bad position, then say, okay, well then let me start working on getting out of that position, whether you ended up there intentionally or unintentionally. And so I guess when you're talking about what does it look like, that's just how I look at life. And I generally think that when you look at it that way, there's really no such thing as wasted time or wasted effort. It's simply a matter of acquiring information and then applying it. Like, one of my favorite military concepts is what in the Air Force they call it Ooda Loops, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. So, in the military, they look at that as, observe a threat, orient yourself to the threat, decide what you're going to do about your threat, and then take action. And then what they found is the most successful pilots do that cycle as many times as possible, and they start that cycle first. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but what they train Air Force pilots is, it's not the person who makes the best decision, it's the person who makes the first decision who wins, because that person started the process. They started the iteration sooner than the person who was hesitating and waiting and trying to make the best decision. And so there's an information collection stage to any decision you're making. There's thought that should go into decisions. I'm not saying like take rash action constantly, but I love that concept because it's all about iteration. It's about a learner's mindset, and it's about adjusting. So, whenever I'm in doubt, I just make a decision. And if I don't like the decision I made, I make another decision. And then there's a legendary wrestling concept too. And I mean, you're probably hearing this, which is, even in this answer, is like, I'm pulling in concepts from the Air Force, from jujitsu, and so there's also a wrestling concept that I love. I forget his name, unfortunately, but there's a legendary wrestling coach, and his acronym, he called it WIN. So WIN stands for what's important now. And sort of the basis of that idea is, it's like, all right, so let's say you're wrestling, you're at a certain angle, you're in a certain position, he's got a certain grip, whatever it is. And what he's trying to coach his students into doing is saying, okay, well, it's like a second ago, he had a collar tie, but now he's holding your elbow. And so he doesn't want you thinking the same way you were thinking when he had a collar tie. He wants you to think about what's important now. Do you want to strip the grip? Do you want to feint something? Do you want to, change your angle and shoot for a takedown or for a double leg or whatever? And so, even just ideas like that, I found to be really foundational to my own personal development, my professional development, my development in relationships. And it's also really built a mindset of, how do I put it? I guess, for lack of a better word, just kind of fearless, in the sense that if I make a mistake, there are a few mistakes in life that are fatal. And there are a few mistakes you can make in relationships that are fatal. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of the mistakes that we make are 100% fixable. Sometimes they're frustrating. Sometimes they take more time than other mistakes. But at the end of the day, a mistake is just not the end 99% of the time. And so I'm not afraid of very many things when I am approaching that. And I don't want to sound arrogant when I say that. Obviously, I have my own insecurities and my own blind spots, but that's just how I look at things.
Well, I think that as we're kind of honing in on this idea of what is a functional education, I think you made a great observation here, which is a functional education is not static, and it's very very tempting, and it's very easy to have an assumed answer about a static education. I worked really hard and got great grades. I got into a great school. I went to that school and paid them a great amount of money, and they gave me a great degree. And so now I'm that degree now magically unlocks doors to the rest of my life. And maybe there was a time when that was true when degrees were much less frequent, and so that puts you in a rarefied supply and demand type thing where there was a low supply of college graduates and so a high demand. But that's certainly not the case now. And so there's nothing static about a degree now. And so instead, functional education is one that teaches you to be in a constant OODA loop. So you have to constantly be coming back to this and saying, all right, orient. Circumstances have changed. COVID came and the world completely shifted on me. Okay. What does that say? Okay. Observe. Now, what's going on because of this new thing? Okay. Decide. Now I have to do something. Now act. Now actually get on and do it, because you can't just decide and then go, oh, I made this. Oh, there it went. Oh, I made this. Oh, I forgot about it again. You have to actually decide, and then you have to actually act. And then as soon as that happens, you got to start the process again. You got to be the first to observe, okay, now COVID has gone on longer than we think. What does this mean? What happens if COVID continues for other way? How has the world changed? Some of the things we're talking about is all of a sudden, for years, Ben and I both in various fashions have worked in different on-site locations. We've also done a lot of remote work. Remote work was kind of like homeschooling for a while there. People were very skeptical about the outcomes of it, right? Now everybody's a remote worker. What does that mean? How does that change the world, right? A functional education says, okay, how does that apply to me now? And so if we're talking about a functional education, what a functional education is, it's one that's not static. It's one that's constantly in motion. It's one that's constantly being evaluated. It's one that's constantly learning.
Absolutely. Yeah. The way I look at it is life is a moving target. And so any model of learning, or even any way of sort of planning your life that involves that is more or less inflexible, which I think is probably one of the main faults with our current education system, is it's been the same for decades, which is why it's becoming more and more irrelevant, and why students are feeling that more and more. They're sitting on Zoom, paying all this money to get a credential for things they can learn for free on the internet, right? Like, what kind of world is that? And that, I think, is really when we talk about, do we need college? And then say, okay, well, maybe we do, but then is it doing what we need it to do? I think that's the case against it. That's the case against it's not doing it's not giving students what they need right now, because it's an incredibly inflexible model. It hasn't adjusted to the way that the world has changed. And even speaking about how the world has changed, and just it's like, and the credentials become less and less relevant. Some big news recently in the industry is just that, like, Google's offering certificates now, and some employers are treating that like a degree. You could pay $50 for 6 months and get a certificate from Google, and then go get a job, and that's treated like a degree. And that type of thing is going to be happening more and more. And we could debate like what the timeline is going to be, and who are going to be the people who come out on top. But the thing that seems undeniable at this point is that the model is going to change, period. And so I think what I'd love to close on is kind of and this is a little bit of a can of worms in itself, but education's changing. Colleges are becoming, I won't say colleges are becoming irrelevant, but at least their style of education is becoming less and less relevant. And that's becoming, painfully apparent with COVID and all of this online classes. And so students are going to be changing how they're learning. Maybe they're looking at something functional. Maybe they're looking at a certificate. Maybe they're still looking for a traditional degree. But regardless, everyone is changing how they're learning. And so what I'd love to get a few thoughts from you on is just essentially, how would you recommend that a student know whether or not the education they're getting is good? And that's what I mean when I say it's a can of worms, because it's like, what do you even say is a good education? That's a big question, but I'm curious to know what you think.
Well, I think in so many things you have to start with defining the outcome. What is it you're trying to do, right? And so if you don't know where you're going and you don't know what this education's for, you have no way of knowing whether it's good. And this is, again, an assumed answer. Too many people go to college thinking that the college degree will magically open the doors that they need, and in the process will help them figure out what doors they need open. Maybe that was true at one point, but it's too expensive now. If nothing else, it's just a ridiculous amount of money to pay if you don't know where you're going to wind up. And so maybe the most important thing I can tell you is that if you're considering educational options and trying to evaluate it, in order to be able to assess whether you're getting a good education or not, you have to have a really strong grasp of where you want to wind up. Now, I don't think this means you have to have the rest of your life figured out, but you have to have a strong indication going in the right direction. Back to our examples of specialization here, right? If you are pretty sure that you have a calling and a desire and an interest in being in the medical profession and you're shooting for an MD, right? And there's all kinds of other places you could land, then you can evaluate your college experience by how well the school that you're going to get into prepares people and gets them into medical school. That's a pretty cut and dried traditional educational type thing. And it's very, very relevant. It's very appropriate for the kind of thing you're looking at. On the other hand, if you're in this functional education camp, like we've been talking about, well, then that shifts things dramatically. And then I would ask these questions, right? Is this an education that is giving me tools to help me learn how to quickly and effectively master complicated information? Is this an education that I can hack, I can use, or I can do in such a way that is teaching me the tools? And if that's the case, then I want the cost to be pretty low. I want the flexibility to be pretty high. I care less about the extreme quality of the content because it's not the actual stuff I'm learning. It's a process I use to learn that. And so this is interesting. I probably want as little instruction as possible, right? If I have a lot of instruction, then somebody else is telling me everything I need. If I've got less instruction, then I have to figure it out. And so the onus is on me to figure it out. And that's what I'm looking for. Well, there's a beautiful sort of symmetry there because the less instruction you have, the more flexibility you have, the more the cost drops. Trying to reveal it here, but that looks like online education, right? Online education is the kind of thing that's going to give you those kinds of access points, right? So that's going to be the educational piece is going to be functional. And then the second question asked is this an education that gives me a lot of time to be in the real life? And so the more time I have in real life, the more functional this education is going to be, the more I'm actually going to be able to test the ideas I'm learning and see if they work. And then I'm going to actually be able to observe them and learn them. And then finally, is this an education that's going to expose me to new places and new people? And an educational process that does that. Now, look, we're not trying to be fancy here. That looks an awful lot like Ascend because that's the idea that built Ascend, right? That's the educational model we were working on. And we were trying to answer those questions. And so, yes, it looks like that. But certainly would love for you to come and check that out and see what we're doing there. But I'm also telling you that if you ask those questions, you can find all kinds of ways to build a functional education inside traditional education model, inventing it yourself, or doing something like Ascend, which we certainly are really excited about offering to you. But the point is that those are the ways that you can kind of evaluate your educational process, whether it's a good one or not. Start with having an idea of where you want to go, and then be able to measure against that. And if you're measuring for a functional education, measure on the academics and being able to learn how much time you spend in real life and the kind of network and experiences you'll be able to get.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And even going back and talking about the functional fitness analogy, one of my one of the approaches to functional fitness I find most fascinating is one that's supported or proposed, however you want to say it, by a guy named Dr. Peter Attia. And what he talks about is, I forget what he calls it, sedentarian fitness or something like that, whatever the word is for 100 years. And basically the idea is, he says, for example, it's like, if you're looking at saying, all right, well, when I'm 80, I'm probably going to be a grandparent, and I'm probably going to want to be able to play with my grandkids on the floor. He says, okay, well, let's work backwards from that goal to make sure that you have that ability when you're 80 years old. And so the way he works that idea out is, he says, all right, he says, let's say, for example, you want to be able to pick up a 30-pound kid off the floor at the age 80. He's like, well, then how much do you need to be able to pick up off the floor at the age of 45? And he's like, all right, well, that means I need to be able to deadlift X amount of weight. And then he does this math, because he's a doctor and he's way smarter than me. So he does this math and he says, all right, so that means that if I could deadlift X amount and I work up to that goal by this age, and then I continue, kind of a descending amount of weight, then by this age, I'll be able to pick up a 30-pound grandkid. And I think that's so interesting. And it seems incredibly wise. And so when I think about that, I think about the same thing, which is to think about the end goal. And then the only other thing I would kind of throw into defining what is a good education is, does it prepare you for unexpected events? Things like all of the things that have been happening this year and the way that it's changed so many people's lives. The people who are thriving right now are the people who are the best at adapting. And so, I would prioritize an education that helps you, that really helps you, get to an end goal that you want, but also gives you training in adaptation and in learning how to learn, and all those things that we talked about. Well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you joining me, Jonathan, for this. It's been fascinating. And when you brought this concept up a couple of weeks ago, I knew we wanted to do a podcast about it, just because it's kind of it's a core part of our education philosophy at Unbound. And it's a lot of these ideas are what go into the Ascend College program that we offer. And so if this whole thing sounds interesting to you and you're a college age student, or someone who is, you can visit beunbound.us/ascend. I'll put a link in the description as well. And you can learn more about our college program, everything that goes into it. And if it sounds right for you, then we'd love to see you in our program. And with that, we will catch you guys next week.